And welcome to another edition of Odyssey House Journals. I'm Trip Mitchell, and I get to say hi every week and then turn it over to Randall Carlisle.
Hello. Our lead story tonight on ABC4. Oh, I'm not a news guy anymore, am I?
You are not, but you know what I'm amazed is that Randall is so good on this show, and you write everything out on a teleprompter.
Well, that's all I've learned to be able to do. I can't even think for myself without having a teleprompter there. And I'm reading, wait, you got to keep the teleprompter rolling or I've got to stop talking.
Have you ever worked at a, no, you never have. There are teleprompters, so essentially what we're talking about is a teleprompter is the device that allows people to see the script, news people, to see the script and to read.
Be looking right into the camera while you're reading. It's reflected up.
Exactly. And we have one in our other studio, but most news people, if the teleprompter stops, you're in trouble. Now, you do have a script in front of you.
Yes, you do.
But have you had teleprompter fails?
Well, the first station I worked at was in Colorado Springs, and it was a small staff, and you had to run it yourself with a foot pedal.
That's what I was going to ask you.
And it was like, and back then it wasn't computerized, so you had sheets of paper that you would tape together, going down a belt that rolled underneath the camera that then projected it up in front of the camera that people were watching you on. And you control the speed with like a pedal, like the speed of your car. And if the papers would all of a sudden get stuck in the middle of a segment, you didn't have the teleprompter anymore, and you had to wait for a commercial break to go out and fix the teleprompter and fix it. So it was, and that was my first job in TV. And I found I'd look at a videotape of a newscast, and I was sitting there doing this because I was controlling the pedal, and people must have thought the guy's weird, just going like this all the time.
Yeah, teleprompters are the greatest tool in the world, or they can be your least.
Exactly.
And when they go bad, and what you're supposed to do is have your script, and as you go to the next page on your teleprompter, where you are. But none of us ever did that.
There you go.
And
hey, I've got to tell you something. You'll find this interesting. I put out this little press release, and we got some coverage a while back from Odyssey House, and this is really interesting because I had our admission director come up one day and say, "There's something weird going on here because we're getting so many admissions of people listing alcohol as their main problem. Normally, it's a small portion of the people we admit, and normally it's heroin or some kind of opioid or meth. And the release that I put out is we've seen a 78% increase in the number of clients coming in claiming alcohol is their big problem. I just looked up some figures from May 1st of this year through June 15th. Nearly half of all our clients, 49%, said alcohol was the main reason they were coming in for treatment. Same period last year, it was only 28%.
Do you think it's Corona-19?
I do. It's the thing I find weird about it, and as you well know, it's all of us being in recovery, is the one thing that they tell us not to do, and that the big book talks about it, and therapists talk about, is don't isolate. Okay, and so what are we being told through this whole pandemic? Isolate, And so you got a lot of people sitting at home, and alcohol is still considered an essential industry in Utah. So the DABC stores have been open. You're sitting there alone. Maybe you don't have a job. Maybe you're able to work from home where nobody could smell your breath or anything else. And for an alcoholic, that's a tempting combination.
And you had the best line, which I've quoted, and I'm actually not giving you credit for it ever.
What's that?
When you moved to Utah, to think that there would be a time when the liquor stores are open and the LDS churches are closed.
Yeah.
That was
unbelievable. Yeah.
So that is really intriguing. And on the last show, we had Travis Whitaker on from Maple Mountain. That was a great show. Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about, did AA or recovery programs let people down by not being open during the pandemic? And there's some people argue that even though there was a high risk of transmission of COVID-19, that people would have been better served. I don't think that's the case, but it's open to debate.
Well, AA meetings have been put on Zoom, which I don't like, but it's better than nothing. But a lot of treatment centers have kept with a lot of stringent requirements, kept, and Odyssey House is one that we've kept our residential facilities open. But, so we still have several hundred people living in our residential facilities, but they can't have visitors. They have to do Zoom visits with their relatives.
So there's a price to pay.
And all the therapists who work at like one house just stay at that house. A lot of times we'd have a therapist who would work at this house, then this house, and this house on different days, and everybody stays at one house. And I mean, we just changed the way we do business.
Yeah, it is a scary time. Well, our guest today, go ahead, you have something.
Well, I know our guest. I mean, how many times have you seen TV programs or podcasts or whatever where you keep talking about this mythical person behind the camera? And we are always talking about this guy named Lee.
He's our Gelman.
Yes. Does he exist? I mean, is he real?
And is he in recovery?
There you go.
Well, Lee Spencer, come on down.
All right.
Hey, Lee. Here he is, the guy who's supposed to be behind the camera. So what he did was hit record, and it's still going, I
Coming
presume.
over here. Yeah, I hope so.
So
Can't see from here.
Lee and I met at the Noon Alano Club meeting a couple of years ago.
We did.
And you had somehow found out that I was in this crazy business.
Yeah, I listen, and you're a talker.
He does that a lot, doesn't
Yeah,
he?
so
Yeah.
it didn't
I-
take me
well,
long
when
to
I-
figure out what you're up to.
When I share, I don't really want to tell. I want people to laugh.
Right.
That's kind of my gig at Recovery, and because there are a lot of people who in AA meetings who are there to bore people.
Right.
And
so.
I try,
And that frequently happens.
Seems that way.
and my home group in Vegas, we used to time people and have bets going around because there's certain people who do that. But Lee, you're one of those people who's very reflective, and I didn't really realize your story in AA until I went to a speakers meeting, and you talked about how you got into recovery coming from a Mormon background, and you're still a member of the church. So.
Right. Card carrying Mormon.
Yeah, and that is.
Can I see your card?
Sure.
Is there a special card?
Well, yeah, getting the temple recommend, yeah.
Okay, so you got
No,
one.
I mean, so when I use that, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek statement, but it is a card.
Yeah.
And so when I say I'm card carrying Mormon, that actually means
Yes.
something. I mean, not in the Mormon community, but
Yes.
it's kind of.
Because one would perceive that alcoholism is not a big part of the Mormon experience, but as our guest last week explained, that drugs have become a big part of the
Right.
Mormon experience. So, and first of all, we want to thank you for working on this show. This is all a volunteer effort by Randall and myself, and our part of the show is this much. You do the hard work.
Yes, he does.
Well, it's an enjoyable experience. Number one, I believe in the concept. The subject matter of what we're talking about is very important to me. And so I believe in that. But I like telling stories. I mean, when I heard you talk about what you were doing in that nooner meeting in Lano Club, I didn't hear that from when you pitched. I heard it from when you're talking to all your friends, when you come in there. It didn't take me long to figure out that you're in TV business, you did this kind of stuff. And I know from experience that editing, taking a camera out and capturing something, that's the easy part. But make it into a usable product afterwards, that's the hard part. So that's why I suggested, well, if you have any need for editing, so one thing led to another, and then you met Randall. And so all of a sudden we've got an opportunity to actually work together, and that was quite a
And one of the cool experiences, Randall was nice enough to invite us down, and so it's probably 2 years ago
Yeah,
that we started. Yeah, and went down and visited Alano Club and found
visited Odyssey.
Odyssey House, excuse me. It was one of the two.
They all look the same.
Yeah, all look the same to us, yeah.
But
Just
we
a
had-
bunch of drugs.
Yeah, we had a chance to visit and go through all these
Yeah,
campuses,
we did.
and being associated with Odyssey House has been a pleasure.
Oh, it's
Because
been
literally, 800 to 1,000 people in treatment.
A day.
Yeah, a day is an amazing story. And
Well, it's interesting listening to Travis make the comment that alcoholism, drug abuse, and drug addiction is not a respect of persons. And I think that's the reason why I enjoy being around the recovery world, is because you're around all kinds of people. We all suffer from similar problems. Just our drug of choice is what makes it
Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
But it's a wonderful place to be around people like that.
so tell us your story.
But first of all,
Oh.
ready for a drum roll. How many years do you have sobriety?
Okay, so I stopped drinking on November 22nd, 1975.
Okay, you do the
And
math.
so that's
44?
44 years, yeah. So I'll be.
I didn't do any math. He told me ahead of time. So
Well, and the funny part of working with Lee is one of the other projects we do is a very R-rated show, which has since blown up because the hosts aren't talking to each other. And I said to Lee, I go, when I seen you at a speakers meeting and found out you were LDS, I go, does covering this type of show offend you? And you had a great line. You said,
well, what you experience as a combat Marine in Vietnam makes everything else pale by comparison.
yeah.
I
So
believe
I
that.
could pretty much take anything.
Were you doing drugs and alcohol while you were in Vietnam?
Not drugs. I've never taken drugs. I smoked one joint in my life. That's as deep as.
And that was this morning before you. I gotta do
well,
that.
I can get ready. No, but
That's why he's so loose on the show today. Yeah.
well, as close
It's a
as
shaky camp.
It's funny. As close as I ever came, I was on a patrol one day, and a buddy of mine, he was a marijuana user all the time, and I had a fifth of Jim Beam in me. By the time I said, "Man, I'm ready to do that marijuana," and he was smart enough to say, "No, you're not. You're not going to do it." And that's I probably would have gotten into it if he hadn't stopped me.
Was it tough to find a fifth of Jim Beam in Vietnam?
Anytime you're around, when we'd go out on patrol, more often than not, we'd run across Army people out there too. And anytime you came across an Army, they always had Jim Beam. I don't know what it was, with a PX or supplies, whatever, but they always had Jim Beam. So,
Marines are tougher than Army people.
well, it's different. It's just a different experience. But that's why I always look forward to crossing paths with Army.
With Army.
Because they always
The
had
U.S. Army, sponsored by Jim Beam.
They always had a fifth of Jim Beam somewhere.
Did you actually drink while you were in combat?
Oh yeah, all the time. Yeah, if you could get it, you drank it.
Wow.
You know, I've this is insane, but I've had this thought that if I knew that my plane was going to crash and that things were going bad, would I want to drink as many bottles as possible,
Makes you wonder.
or be sober to try to get out that door?
Yeah, we were rationing 2 beers a day, and they happened to be warm beers at the time. And I knew that I had a problem with alcoholism, or that, you know, that gnawing need to have some. I mean, that if you've never experienced that, it's a tough thing. But I was going to save my beers until the next day so I could build them up and have 4 beers. Doesn't that make sense?
Typical alcoholic thinking.
Yeah.
2 aren't going to do it.
That's
so
right.
If I got 4.
Once I made that decision, it took me about an hour and a half before I could not drink those beers. And
warm
Yeah,
Budweiser.
didn't matter. But see, I was only like 20 years old, and at the time I thought, I had that little gnawing thought that, you know, there's something wrong. If you can't stop, if you can't put away that, there's something wrong. And that's the first inkling that I had a problem with alcohol.
But in Vietnam, I would think that everything else would be you've got a chance to lose your life, limbs the very next day. That
Yeah, but you don't think about that stuff in the combat zone. I mean, it's always there. It's like a pilot. If you think of a commercial pilot, you know, they don't give them parachutes when they get on these commercial planes. And so you know, if there's a problem on board, you're going down with the plane one way or another. And it's just a mindset that you get. And that's the same way when you're in a combat situation. It's just there. You're not thinking about it. You're not going to prepare. Well, what I got to be smart, so I don't. You don't think about that. It's just you just do your daily stuff and you just go through it.
So being a young Mormon kid, how did you get involved with alcohol?
Well, now that's an interesting thing because my dad, he grew up in the church kind of like I did, and it's interesting hearing other people on these shows talk about the genetic, the DNA. Is it in your DNA? Is it inherited? And my grandfather, who I never met, what I've learned about him is had a similar kind of life. He grew up in the church, but he didn't really go to church. They called Jack Mormons. I haven't heard that expression for a long time, but that's what it is. It's the way my dad was, and so there was always alcohol in our house. And so I remember sneaking upstairs. My room was in the basement of our house, and we lived in Syracuse at the time. It's up by Ogden. And I remember on Friday nights, my parents would have these parties. They'd have friends over there, and I remember sneaking up there as a 10-year-old, thinking, "Oh, I'm gonna have it." Didn't it look great when you see people drinking? I mean, to see the commercials. I mean, they're having a
They're
good
all
time.
having fun.
Oh, I want to do that. Well, as a 10-year-old, I wanted to embrace that world, and of course, you're not. And so I sneaked upstairs this one time, and I saw these brightly colored bottles on a counter.
Right.
Wow! And I seen what I'm thinking of is soda pop. And so I poured out this thing, and I remember seeing a turkey on the label. There was a turkey, so I thought this is gonna be great. And I could not believe how awful it tasted. But that was my first taste of alcohol. And for some reason, and this addresses the alcoholic mind, I couldn't do it again fast enough.
really,
Oh, yeah.
even at the age of 10.
Oh, even, yeah. I mean, I hurried and got downstairs, and that was the only one gulp, and that was it. And I just remember how awful it tasted. But the next Friday, they were up there, I was sneaking up that room. And it wasn't long before we were sneaking it I remember as a 12-year-old, we went on a scout trip up to Hebgen Lake in Montana. And I had a bottle of Virginia Dare wine that my buddy had stolen from his granddad when we went on a scout trip. And we had a good time with that. But yeah, so I've been around alcohol all my life.
Wow.
Yeah, it's funny how we all have the stories. And Randall, did you start at an early age? Do you
Yeah, I started, I think, 13. And I liked, I remember, and of course alcoholism runs in my family too, but I remember how it made, I used to feel real insecure around women or in social girls at that time, in social settings, and I remember how it made me feel just emboldened and just powerful and cool, and I liked that feeling, and so I started drinking at 13 anytime I could sneak some from my parents or somebody else's
Did
parents.
you fill the bottle back up with water?
Yes. But
That's problematic.
it's not with vodka or gin.
Yeah.
But with whiskey it is,
Oh,
because it starts getting lighter in color, you know.
Well, then the funny one of our friends' daughters was doing the same thing, but they put the water into the vodka and then put the vodka back in the freezer, and boom.
Yeah, it was pretty freeze. That's right.
Yeah, so it's funny how we have these universal things,
Yeah.
but as you get into treatment, you think about it, the taste, whoever designs this whole planet, the first taste of alcohol is not
It's
great.
terrible.
No, it's awful. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
learned experience. There's no doubt about it. I've always, my whole life, while I was drinking, I was looking for that drink that tasted good. I never found it. Never found it.
Oh, I did.
What'd you find?
Once you develop a taste for it, a beer is.
You see, I think beer tasted terrible to
Yeah.
me when I was a kid, but I forced myself and
Somehow we
went
get
through
through
it.
it. Yeah.
And the only drinks that ever tasted good were what we call sissy drinks,
Right.
like, you know,
Slow gins and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, slow.
And
Apricot brandy.
the funny thing is, one of my favorite podcasts is a podcast called Spittin' Chicklets.
Ah, right.
And it's a huge financial juggernaut, and it's a hockey podcast, and it's a euphemism for when you have a puck hitting you in the face, you spit your teeth out. But they have gotten behind a girl's drink called a Pink Whitney, which is vodka and pink lemonade. And New Amsterdam Vodka, which is owned by Gallo, developed this just for the show, and it's the biggest runaway hit in the liquor industry
Really?
in all of North America.
Because it tastes good.
Yeah, it's
Well,
kind of a
novelty. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a sugary vodka
Sure.
drink, so it shows that people don't
So
like
here
it.
we are on a
Yeah.
show about recovery, talking
Talking
about
about
drinks that
Novelty
taste
drinks,
good.
yeah. Well, it's an interesting thing when you talk about this LDS community here. I remember going in grade school, seeing these health films. You know how they show you, to avoid this, do that. And I remember seeing a health film as to how to avoid heroin. I'd never heard heroin, and I thought at the time, how in the world are you talking about heroin in Utah? That makes no sense. But what I have since learned is that heroin was thriving at that time. I mean, alcoholism and drug abuse has been around in Utah for years. It's not some recent phenomenon, and that's what really is the interesting part about this place.
You know, when we were talking about it in last week's guest with Travis, how we don't know the numbers in recovery in Utah, and Randall, you would love to know that number.
Yeah.
But this show is probably the #1 non-KSL crime show
Right.
in the whole area. We've had 12,000 downloads in a week, and so the recovery community is bigger than anyone even guesses.
I can guarantee you, everybody is touched by alcoholism and drug abuse. I mean, whether it's not you, your family, and
A neighbor, a church member,
that's right,
a
somebody.
distant relative,
Right.
somebody. Yeah, you're right.
yeah, my wife right now is going through a situation where she has trouble sleeping, and so she's using Ambien, and she, she's not had a drink in her life. When I talk about 44 years, she said, I got 65 years. so length of time is not, but she's dealing with the same thing where you're putting a synthetic substance in your body to fix something, and you get addicted to it. It's because your body adjusts to this stuff.
Right.
It's an interesting world we live in, but
Yeah.
it touches all lives.
So we're going to take a short break. When we come back, Lee, we're going to start you at the beginning.
All right.
And see how you've managed to associate with people like Randall and still stay sober.
That's right.
All right.
That's the hard part.
That's
We'll be
all right.
right back. And welcome back to Odyssey House Journals. Trip Mitchell and Randall Carlisle. Lee Spencer, our guest,
Me.
who is the producer of this show, and we were talking about Lee's experience growing up Mormon and sneaking upstairs to your Jack Mormon father and raiding the liquor cabinets, with both Randall and I did. How did it get out of control?
Well, I've always done things early at my age. I was always sneaking alcohol. My friends were not. So when they started getting into it in high school, I'd already had 4 or 5 years at it.
A veteran drinker.
I was a veteran drinker. I mean, I found out my limits. Even though I drank everything I could get my hands on, I knew that there was a problem. At least I suspected. But I went to the Marine Corps when I was 18, and that just gave me a license to drink. And so I went back to North Carolina where the drinking age was lower, and so you could go to the enlisted men's club and drink all you wanted, and that seemed to give me a reason for doing it. And so when you add that, and then going to Vietnam and going through that experience, and then coming back from Vietnam and having the world not exactly being what I expected it to be coming back, that kind of threw me into a part where I liked to drink. It made me feel good. And so
just isolating on that, when a lot of amazing people came back from Vietnam, they not only were not lionized like they should be, they're actually being criticized.
Yeah, it hadn't gotten that bad, because I came back from Vietnam in '68, in November '68, and so it hadn't gotten quite that bad by then. But by the '70s, I mean, it was going full blown. I mean, I'd scared to death telling anybody I'd been to Vietnam. You a baby killer? I hadn't really thought about it from that perspective, you know. But yeah, so anyway, so from the time that I went in the Marine Corps when I was 18 until I was 28, I mean, I drank as much as I could possibly get my hands on, and by the time I was 28, I mean, my life had gone downhill enough to where I realized that I had a problem just adjusting to life, and so I was always looking for that perfect drink, and I remember seeing in a magazine this commercial for Hennessy cognac, and I'd heard in movies how, you know, oh, give me a cognac.
It's a very sophisticated thing to do.
It was this thing, yes. I thought, well, and I thought, well, hey, let's try that. So I went down to the liquor store and bought a big bottle of Hennessy, and I remember it was a Friday night, and I just drank it and got sick. You know, it was awful.
The whole bottle.
It's very sugary, isn't it?
No, it's not. I mean, it tastes just like bourbon to me.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's pretty yucky though.
I had to shove the first drink down, but after that it was all right. But yeah, I did not like the taste, is my point. But it was such an awful thing after that I thought, you know, there's a problem. And coincidentally, my neighbor happened to be the clerk for the LDS Church Ward building at the time. I hadn't gone to church for 10 years. I hadn't been. I mean, Mother's Day was as close as I ever came to actually going to church. And he happened to find my records. And I lived right behind his house where he was. And so I remember it was a Saturday morning. I was in talking with my landlady in her patio. And I still remember this little guy coming into the patio with his paper. He said, "Hey, is your name Lee Spencer?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm not sure what it's all about." And he said, "Well, are you a Mormon?" And I thought, "Yeah, I am." And he says, "Well, why don't you go to church?" That's all he said. And I said, "Well, I don't have a good reason." And because of my experience at night with that bottle of Hennessy, and him saying, "Well, why don't you come to church?" I started going back to church. And it's interesting because I haven't never gone through a recovery program, but that was really my recovery program, was going back to church.
So one bottle of Hennessy turned you around?
Well, that was
the culmination.
Yeah, it was many. But it was just going back to church and embracing a life where I was actually accepted, people were nice to me and stuff, and it was just an interesting experience how that was enough to keep me on the straight and narrow for all this time.
Well, it's kind of interesting because we've talked on past shows about the psychological or genetic or, you know, experiences that do that. So in your case, the alcohol, not sounding like an armchair psychiatrist here, but it was having good experiences around you, people accepting you,
That's right.
eliminated the need for...
That's right, gave me a purpose, and I've been in recovery now and gone to enough 12-step meetings and seen how recovery works. And watching these programs, watching people tell their stories is quite an education being behind that camera. But I realized that having a purpose and having a support group, for whatever reason, is what we all need. It's what the human being needs.
Right. We
need to feel like we're at peace. And the last 44 years, I haven't always felt that way. But during those critical years of getting started, I did. And that was really critical. But the interesting thing about it is that even though I wasn't drinking, after about 4 years of not drinking, that's when the dry drunk world was starting to happen for me. I mean, I was crazy. I gained 100 pounds, and I was just having trouble just feeling good about myself. And so I got into the 12-step world by really going to Overeaters Anonymous, who embraced the
Really?
Alcoholics Anonymous 12 steps. And that's how I really learned about the 12-step world. And there weren't that many Overeaters Anonymous meetings, OA meetings, so I went to a lot of AA meetings. And so that's when I realized that, an addictive mind is an addictive mind no matter what your drug of choice is. And that's really what I've done this past about 35 years, really, is dealing with the 12 steps from how to deal with me in my life. And it's interesting how it's like we refer to the peeling of an onion, how you take one layer off and then you discover another issue and you peel that layer. And that's what it's been like for me, because you hear about veterans coming back from combat zone and having trauma and stuff like that. Well, I never really realized that was going on in my life. But after about 10 years of being back, I was in Denver, Colorado at the Metro College. I was going to college there at the time. And I went into one of the little workshops there, and there was a guy over on the side of the bench there in a room. There was sand and a block of wood. Looked like Chewbacca, big old beard, bigger than mine. And I just noticed him out of my corner of my eye as I went into this room. And all of a sudden I started, "Hey, is your name Spencer?" I go, "What?" Because nobody knew me there.
Right.
I looked over and there was this guy looking at me, and he says, "Your name's Spencer, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'm Peterman." And I pulled him out of a minefield in '67.
No kidding.
Yeah, after he stepped on mine, we were at this. I was a combat engineer, and we'd put this minefield in. And we had come in there, so I think it was on Christmas Day. And he was right in front of me, and he happened to step on an anti-personnel mine, really hurt his foot. But I remember carrying him out, and that's the last I'd seen him until that day.
Wow.
And it was interesting because we chatted for a little bit, but I couldn't get out of there fast enough. And I didn't realize at the time how all of these memories and things that you go through in combat had all been suppressed. And luckily I was going to 12-step world, in this 12-step meeting. And so I shared this here, and people gathered around me and patted me on the back. "You'll be all right." But it took about 3 days for me to get past that experience.
Wow.
And that's when it all kind of flooding back. But
So the Vietnam experience was, and painful for everyone. I can't imagine that it wasn't. I wonder how previous wars have affected, World War II, where 1 out of every 3 men fought in the war, and I wonder how that's affected our culture and alcohol and drugs and that sort of thing.
well, I think it's phenomenal. And with Netflix and the digital age that we're in now, where so much information is available, all of the stuff that you're referring to has come up. I mean, people experience the same things. I mean, combat is combat. If you're in a situation like that, you can't really describe that. You have to experience to actually know what it's like. But what, the actual ways things work, it's not the romanticized that I grew up with, watching the John
war
Wayne
movies.
war movies and stuff. It's not that at all. So nowadays, more information referring to the world that you brought up is coming, because it's all bad. I mean, guys, you think about the people who went through World War I think what they had to go through.
Yeah.
It's compared to what I went through is, I went through some pretty light stuff compared to what's possible.
My dad went through World War II, and it's my sense that, and most of the World War II veterans are dead or dying right now because of their age, and he never talked about his experiences until he was dying of cancer and was high on morphine or whatever for the pain, and then he started talking about some stuff. But it was when they came back, first of all, they were considered heroes, and they parades for them in the street and everything. And I don't think they talked about a lot of the things they were dealing with. And the one he told me that struck me, and I could see how this would screw you up for life, is he was in the South Pacific. He was a Marine, and they were the first ones going ashore on these little islands, and they didn't know whether there'd be Japanese soldiers there or not. And they came across, I think he told me there were 30 Japanese soldiers on this island, and Dad was only 18 or 19, and they were all so weak because they got lost or whatever, and they didn't have water, they didn't have food, and they were just all lying around. And according to the Code of War, they should have been taken in as prisoners, and his sergeant or whoever was in charge told him to kill them all. And so they just slaughtered 20 or 30 Japanese soldiers. And at the age of 18 or 19, but he never talked about that until he was high on fentanyl at the end of his life, and so obviously it was in his mind the whole time.
Sure.
You know.
Yeah, a day doesn't go by but what you think of it. It's not a haunting experience, but it just passes through your mind. And you see things that trigger things, and you say, oh, he looks like so-and-so, and that's probably what your dad went through.
Sure.
But yeah, it's just one of those things that you have to deal with. And the interesting thing about the topic we're talking about here, as far as alcoholism, drug addiction, and how the human being, we just want to feel better. And the brain is a pleasure-seeking thing. I mean, not necessarily from an entertainment standpoint, but it just wants to feel good. That's what we do. And so the things that we suffer, whether it's the loss of a child, whether it's a war, any number of things that cause trauma, the body is trying to seek a solution to feel better. And the brain's resilient. It'll find a way. It's interesting talking about last week's program, as he was talking about getting all of the drugs and all that kind of stuff. And one thing I found out about alcoholics is we will get what we want. We know how to get what we want, and it's just convincing you that that's not what you want. You want this. And then if you have a purpose, then for some reason the brain shifts gears and works.
So the Travis Whitaker in last week works at a recovery center. When you got sober, recovery centers were probably not near as prevalent.
I didn't even know what a recovery center. That thought.
Betty Ford was kind of the first one.
Betty Ford was the
first one to get any publicity.
That's right.
Yeah, there must have been others at the time.
Well, sanitariums, what you think about it. People go to.
Well, that's right. You read about that in the big book.
Sure.
Right.
You know, that they used to they throw drunks in a hospital and then sedate them until they'd gone through the DTs and then send them out again.
Yeah, you're cured.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting world, isn't it?
Do you, as a veteran, do you look? Is there any thought of jealousy? When you look at how the U.S. has kind of turned around and honor our veterans and try to do, at least through lip service, we try to treat them with all the respect and dignity that they deserve.
I think it's great. My daughter she went in the Army as a young woman. She became a medic. It's where she met her husband. She went to Desert Storm, so she was over there as a medic when they did that. And it's interesting when she came back, just observing all the people that she knew and all of the dependents that set up all these support groups, and she was in contact with all of them. I was amazed. Whoa, it'd be nice to have had that back then. Yeah. But you didn't even think about it that way. I mean, the turbulent times that we as a world and America in general is going through in the 60s and 70s, I'm amazed that we survived it, to be honest with you. And so to think about, it wasn't possible. We didn't even know that was needed.
Right.
Those things just take time to develop. But by the time that George Bush came around and we went over to the Middle East, and by that time we had learned our lesson. Well, we don't want to do it quite this way. Let's do it that way. And that in and of itself will create different problems. And that's what we're suffering through now is a result of all of those things that.
Yeah, the first Gulf War, Herbert Walker Bush was much cleaner, and then the son.
Yeah, it's interesting how. And that's one thing that I have learned about human behavior is you cannot legislate human behavior. People will do what they're going to do. You can alter it a little bit, but people are going to do it. So when you bring up GW, talking about doing that, let's do it right this time. I mean, look at what came out of all that. So we don't know what we're doing half the time.
Yeah, and unforeseen problems, and it makes for very interesting debates. And I am at home with the wife that she supported that fully, and I said you can't look at George W. as being a successful president because he prosecuted a war we didn't need to have, and every life that's lost, or to me, what's more tragic is young people at the peak of their lives get inexorably altered, losing an arm, and the value of those people lost is just tragic.
Well, it's an interesting paradox because you cannot fight war with people that aren't young. Once you get to a certain age and you understand a few things, you won't do that. So it has to be fought with young men that don't know any better. And yet that's the cream of the crop. I mean, that's our future that you're playing cards with. That's a chip you throw on the table, and yet you can't play that game unless you do that.
It's ironic, as we go to tape today, the third week in June, or almost fourth week, Kim Il-jung is starting to show restraint in North Korea. So even the crazy ones realize that war is the least acceptable alternative. This half hour has flown.
That's amazing.
Yes.
Are you going to do a good job editing this show?
I'll do my best.
You will.
I'll make me look better. I always look crazy when I see in a mirror
He's-
what I look like.
That's right. He has. So if you think about it, he has total control.
Yeah.
The editor has total
Yeah.
control over the final product of any taped
That's
thing.
right.
So you could Snapchat Randall and I, and we would look
Yeah.
like crazy people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
make you guys look better. Photoshop me, make me look really
You
good.
can take certain words out and make us say crazy stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing all you do.
Well,
Yeah,
it's my pleasure.
And again, you have done 90% of the work on this project, but it's something I'm very proud of.
That's a
And
good show.
what's really
Yeah.
cool is I meet other people in the recovery community, and they watch it.
Sure.
And and again, if we can affect one life. So the important thing is, if you've got someone in your life who is having challenges, please reach out, talk to anyone. There's so many wonderful people in the Utah recovery community, but in particular, if you want to call Odyssey House at
801-322-3222.
call, and Odyssey House people will get you some information. Again, there are a ton of people and organizations out there to help out, and just the fact that we've met so many people through the show,
Yeah.
that's the inspiring part.
Yes, I agree.
You can get off this thing
Yes.
and have an amazing life.
Yes, and the next time we refer to Lee behind the camera, it's a real person. Yay!
Got evidence now.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Want to thank, by the way, the other member of our crew, Bill Francis. Thanks for helping us out, getting us on Comcast. For Lee and Randall, I'm Tripp, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
See you later.